Okay, so today we're talking about the classification of algae, and they're not part of plants, even though they have characteristics that are like plants. Some of them have cellulose in their around the cell, and some of them have chlorophyll that's green. So that you would think that they'd be part of plants, but they're not. They have other characteristics that have forced them to be removed into this kingdom, the kingdom Protista. But how do we group them? Well, one is by the basic structure, which we said in the early part of this chapter was the thallus. Okay, what shape they have, what kind of thallus do they have, what type of chlorophyll. They're not all green. Some of them are going to be brown, some are going to be other colors, red, golden color. And then what is their cell wall made out of? It's not always made out of cellulose. Some of them are made out of silica, which is kind of like glass. We'll talk about those as well. And then how do they store their food? Do they store their food as starches, or do they store them as oils, or maybe some other way? So the first one that we're going to talk about, or phylum, is going to be Euglenophida. Got to start out right, otherwise we don't pronounce it right. And the specific organism that we're going to talk about is called the Euglena. So you can see why they call it by that kingdom name is because it has Euglena in the front of it. Then there's Chlorophyta. Chlorophyll is typically what color? Commonly called what color? They're green, right? So these are going to be the green algae. Then we have Chrysophyta. I remember when I've tried to memorize what color these algae are. This is one of I came up with some way of remembering these, but I can't remember what it was for Chrysophyta. These are kind of a golden color. They're not green. They're not red. Okay, and then we have Basileophyta, and we'll talk more about that. That name kind of gives you maybe a clue. Phaeophyta, I do remember what helped me to remember this in college was Phaeophyta. The first part sounds like Pharaoh. Pharaoh lives in Egypt, or lived in Egypt, and Egypt has lots of sand, which is brown, so these are the brown algae. Okay, so whatever you need to use, I think there's a student in the other class that's really good at coming up with all kinds of ways of helping her to remember things, the connection between things. And then we have Rhodophyta. Rhod means red. So these are the red algae, like you heard of the red tide, the crimson, what is it, the Alabama, their football team is the Crimson Tide, right? It's named because of this. And then we have the Dinoflagellates. We'll talk about those. They have kind of a unique shape to them, and they have flagella, as the name kind of implies. So the first one we're going to talk about is the Euglenophida, the Euglena. And when you look at this drawing of it, this is the head end of the Euglena, and this is the tail end. You maybe think that the flagella should be at the tail end, but it's not. This one has the flagella at the head end of that, the anterior end. It has two of these. It only shows one in this particular picture, but it has two flagella. Flagella are for what purpose? For movement, right? It's for movement. Now, the Euglena also have another way that kind of helps them move around, or another kind of movement that they're capable of doing is they can scrunch up and then extend themselves. Scrunch up and extend themselves. Scrunch up and extend themselves. Kind of like some worms do in a way, but they kind of scrunch up, get more like a ball, and then they stretch out. And then scrunch up into a ball and then stretch out. So they have more than one way of moving around. The outside of the euglena is kind of firm, and it's called the pellicle. So it's kind of like the tougher layer on the outside is called the pellicle. But here is the euglena kind of scrunching up and then stretching out, crunching up, stretching out. Another structure that you see at the head end is something called an eye spot. Now, you would think as soon as you see eye spot, you think they can see. Well, no, they can't see images. They can only detect light. So if they make their own food, they're probably going to be looking for more or less light. More light, right? You want to find more light. So that eye spot helps them to detect, if I move this way, it's less light. I move back this way, more light. Okay, I'm going to go this way. As far as nutrition, how do they get their food? Because remember, every living thing has to have nutrition or food. They can make their own food. But they also are saprophytic. Okay? We had two names that sounded similar, saprophytic and parasitic. Parasitic meant that the organism would do what? If it's a parasite.
Feed on living things.
They live off of other living things, okay? So guess what this one is then? Saprophytic means all you have to do is take one word off of what she says and change it. Take out the word living and replace it with dead. So they live off of dead, decaying organisms or matter like that. So they're capable of either making their own food, or if maybe it's too dark to make their own food, they can live off of decaying matter that's around. They also have a contractile vacuole because they live in water. So the purpose of the contractile vacuole was to do what? Keep the water, pump water out, because water is always moving in by osmosis. They have to get rid of the extra water, so they fill up with water and then goes to the outside edge of the cell and kind of squirts it out. Okay? It's kind of doing for them what our kidneys do for us, right? As far as reproduction is concerned, they will then double or duplicate their genetic material and just pinch in half and form two new cells. They don't go through the normal process of prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, and then back into interphase. They just carry it, they just pinch off in the middle. There is no known form of sexual reproduction in this particular phylum. So that if they would find one, I'm not sure they'd have to change that, wouldn't they, if they happen to ever run across one that should belong to this kingdom and has sexual reproduction. But there's no way. So in other words, they just are all copies of each other. Okay, another phylum, which happens to be the largest phylum, is Chlorophyllum. I was just thinking about this. It just happened to pop into my mind. There is like a little spray that you can spray in your mouth that if you have a sore throat, and have you ever heard of something called chloroseptic? You just spray it in your mouth and it'll kind of numb your throat. Like also numbs your tongue if you spray it on your tongue too. But it's green colored. I don't know if the chemical they're using is naturally green or if they're just adding a green colorant to it to make it green. I don't know. But anyway, Chlorophylla are green. They're the green algae. So, and if you've ever been to a lake or a pond towards the end of summer, how they get pretty green looking, the green algae. So this is the largest group of those. They have structures in the cell called pyrenoids, and these pyrenoids are actually organelle that store the energy. You remember they make their own food, but they can often make more than they need at that moment, so they store it, and they will store their energy in the form of starch, like, kind of like plants. So you can see why, they might want to put this in the plant kingdom originally, because some green algae do produce starch like plants do. The organisms that we're going to talk about in here, there's Spirogyra, these are kind of like filaments, real thick, thin, like threads. And if you look at it under a microscope, these cells are connected end to end, and inside of the cells, which are usually longer than they're maybe wide, there is like a ribbon of chlorophyll inside of it that kind of spirals up like that. Can you see why they call it Spirogyra? So when you look at it under a microscope and you see that green ribbon inside, you know exactly. I'm looking at Spirogyra. Okay, there is some others that are also green. They produce their own food. They have all these other little shapes. They're not like filaments. They're one-celled organisms, and they're free-floating through the water. And they have all kinds. Like I said, they have all kinds of unique shapes to them. We have a Eulithrex, which it looks a little bit like that, but it has some other structures in it that if you would look at the filaments, you'd see they're a little bit different. This doesn't spiral like that one does, and it can. In some places in here, you might find a bunch of these that have like little clear edges to the cells, but they also form filaments like the Spirogyra does. And these are attached at the bottom with a holdfast, like we talked about earlier. They're stuck to the bottom so the water doesn't wash them away. They stay in one spot. Let the water move by them. Okay, another kind of algae are the golden algae. These do not store starch, but instead they store oils. So there's different ways of storing energy. One is through starch, and this one happens to be as an oil. Okay, now the diatoms belong to the phylum Bacillolariophyta. It says, are an important part of plankton. Remember we talked about plankton? That is very important for a lot of organisms that I would say at the bottom, more at the lower end of the food chain. They in turn will be eaten by other animals typically. But these particular one-cell organisms don't have cellulose on the outside. They have silica. Anybody ever heard of silica before? Know what it is?
Yeah, like silicone.
Not like, yeah, there's also silicone, but that's different than that. Ever heard of silica sand? It's like really white sand, because sand, a lot of white sand is made out of little tiny pieces of quartz. And quartz, sand often is used to make what? Glass. Okay, these glass windows that we have around here are made out of sand and some other ingredients. We melt it, and but silica or quartz is silicon dioxide. So you can see where the silica comes from. But these have little glass shells, or almost like glass houses that they live inside of. And when they die, that doesn't decompose because it's made out of silica, like sand is. Sand doesn't decompose, it just can stay for long periods of time. Have any of you ever heard of the White Cliffs of Dover in England? I know it's a real popular picture that you often see of England. These huge cliffs, and they're just totally snow white. And what they're made of is the remains of just huge quantities of diatoms that died probably during the time of the flood. And they're just all in one spot. Now, diatoms are that, it almost looks like dirt there. If you dig into it, it almost looks like dirt. So they call it diatomaceous earth. Why? Because it's just made out of just many diatoms that have died right there. And we use it in making dynamite. Use it in filters. These little tiny bodies packed pretty tight together. But it's porous so that you can let stuff will run through it. So I can use it like a filter. I can filter out stuff out of the water. But because it's made out of silica, sand, we can use it like we would use sandpaper as a grit. And you can mix it maybe with a paste or something like that. And you can use it for polishing things really nice and smooth because their little shells will scrape and scratch like sandpaper does. And also, because it's porous like that, you can pass certain gases through it, and it'll absorb these gases. Maybe reduce odors and stuff like that. Another type or another phylum of brown are the brown algae. Now, this is the one I said. Well, you think of Phaeophyta, like Pharaoh, Egypt, desert, brown algae. These are the ones that if you've been to the ocean, and you will see, sometimes these have been dislodged or broken off during a time of a storm, and then you'll see these kind of washed up on the beach. That's brown algae. These are multicellular. They're not like the one-celled diatoms that we talked about or some of the others that we've talked about. These are multicellular. They almost look like plants. And can you see why they would think that they maybe belong to the plant kingdom? But they don't have tissues like plants do. So that was, they look like they could be there, but they are missing some important features. And they're almost all marine, which means what? If we say it's marine, they live where? In the water, more specifically in the ocean, right? Now, they produce something that's called algin. In other words, if you would take these plants, dry them, and grind them up into like a powder, you can have something that's called algin. And what do we use these for? One of them, we use them as a thickener in like bought ice cream when you buy it. Have you noticed that when if you leave it in a bowl and let it go to room temperature, it just doesn't turn into a total liquid. You kind of have this foamy looking stuff on the top. Well, that foamy looking stuff that's on the top is actually that thickener that they used in bought ice cream. Now, when you make your own ice cream, like like an ice cream maker, if you let it melt, it just turns to liquid, right? Because that's what you poured in there when you started to make it. It just turned. But if you would add some of this to it, you could have more of the consistency of bought ice cream. Now, one of the things about have you ever noticed this difference between homemade ice cream and ice cream you buy in the store? If you have put both of them in the freezer for an extended period of time, which one's easier to scoop? Isn't the bought ice cream, ones you got at the store, easier to scoop? Homemade ice cream gets really hard. And it's the thickener that makes it easier to scoop. So I think that's one of the reasons why they add it, because even when it's been in the freezer, you can still scoop it with a spoon or something like that. Oh, the other thing is, no, that wasn't it. Okay. Now, we have another phylum where the algae are not golden, they're not brown, they're not diatoms, or these other things that we've talked about. They're red. They're actually red algae. And the marine algae, it says, will help to form reefs and islands. If you think about out in the Pacific, they have a lot of these islands. that are made up of, some of them are made of coral, but there's others that are made out of these. So they're going to be a lot stiffer structures in these, you know, because you have a whole bunch of them living together. One of the things that we get from red algae, I don't know if you've ever heard of this term right here. How would you pronounce that? Carrageenan. Okay, carrageenan is put into a lot of different things. It's just dried red algae ground up, and we use it in food, kind of like as fillers in food and things like that. It's also used in cosmetics. Here's a part that maybe you've experienced. Have you ever taken pills, little capsules that have, you know, powder or medicine on the inside? You know, you can actually pull the two halves apart sometimes, or sometimes it's all. That shell on the outside is made out of that, and it will, your body can soften it up in your stomach and, you know, release the medicine. So it's used to make those little gelatin capsules that they put medicine or pain relievers. Like if you have, like Tylenol or acetaminophen, you know, they're often inside of little capsules like that, right? Now, another thing we get from this particular algae is something called agar. Have you ever seen Petri dishes? They're often about this big around, and they're only about this deep, and they have this yellowish brown jello-like stuff on the bottom of it, and you can use it to grow bacteria. You know, like if they were, for instance, let's say, testing you for strep throat, which remember was streptococcus bacteria. They could take a swab your throat, and then they would take one of these Petri dishes and take the swab and just swirl it along like this, and then they put it into an incubator. In other words, a place that has identical conditions to the temperature of your body, and see if any bacteria will grow. If it does, and they look at these bacteria under the microscope, and they're little round balls attached to each other, that's streptococcus, and you have strep throat. So that agar, that yellowish brown jello-like stuff in the bottom of these Petri dishes is called agar. And the bacteria need something to grow from. They need some nutrients. So typically we'll take some of this agar and heat it up like you do Jello, where it's a liquid, and then we'll add some nutrients to it, maybe like beef broth or something like that, to it, and then we'll pour it into these little dishes and allow them to cool, and then it turns into this Jello-like stuff in the bottom of it. But that's agar. Okay, another type of algae are called the Dinoflagellates. To me, when I look at their shape, they kind of look like two helmets put together, or somebody said in the other class they look like maybe two turtle shells, you know, the bottoms of the shells put together, and then they have this groove around the edge, and in that groove is where they have flagella attached in that groove. And they, again, flagella are for allowing them to be able to move around. If you've ever, I don't know if you've ever seen this, if you've been to along the Caribbean Ocean Gulf Coast, Caribbean Ocean, at certain times of the year, you go out there after dark, and the water is actually glowing blue. And these organisms in the water will cause it to glow blue. Now, here it says they will emit light when the water is disturbed, but I've also seen just kind of the reverse, where it's glowing like this, and somebody took a video of people. This is like the beach right here. There's a horizon, and there's, I think, some trees over here, it looks like. But it's glowing right here in the surf, where it's probably being disturbed because, you know, the water is sloshing up on the beach. So it's disturbing them and making them glow here in the shallow water. And the video I saw most recently was somebody was running through that shallow water, and everywhere they would step, they would stop glowing. I'm not sure why you'd think they were being disturbed, but they already, I guess, were disturbed, and now they just suddenly stopped glowing. So you could see where every place they splashed in the water with their feet where they had stepped. So they are capable of making their own light. I mean, you can't use them for a light bulb or anything like that, but they have this eerie, bluish glow to them in the water. Now, they're also responsible for the red tide. Now, some of you maybe have heard that if you've been along the Gulf Coast. It happens more like in July and August, where these these algae will multiply in such huge numbers that the water will have this reddish look to it. These algae produce poisons. Now, it's actually just a product, waste product that they give off, but to us that functions as a poison. To fish, it'll actually kill fish. Or if you eat some fish that have eaten some of these, you can get the poison in you. So it makes you really sick, or like fish, it'll kill the fish. And so whenever they have these red tides, it kills a lot of fish, and so the fishermen that are down there, you know, can't catch those fish that are alive because they could have this poison in them, and people who eat them are going to get sick. So it kind of just shuts down the fishing industry for a little while, if that should happen. Okay, so now let's shift from algae to the fungi, the fungus. Okay, fungi do not produce their own food. They're all heterotrophic. They're all decomposers. They're all decomposing some dead plant or animal material. Can I have your attention, Will? There you go. Okay, they have no true tissues, so that's the reason why we can't put them elsewhere in other kingdoms. They have no true tissues. They're unlike fungi. They have cell walls that contain cellulose. Okay, not like some of the things that we talked about as algae. They can move around. Some of them are capable of moving around, at least in some phase of their life cycle. They can move around a little bit. Okay, now let's talk about the kinds of fungi that we can have. One is we would call the water moles. I don't know if any of you have ever had an aquarium where some of the fish have died, and maybe you haven't maintained the aquarium very carefully, and this fish has been dead for a number of days, and you look at it and it's all covered with this white fuzzy stuff. Well, that white fuzzy stuff is a water mold. It's a mold that, remember, they live off of dead, decaying. This fish is dead, so it's living off of it. When a fish is alive, they don't have that. They have ways of preventing that from happening. Okay. Now, water moles have sexual and asexual forms of reproduction. Down here on the bottom, we have blighted leaves, we would say that. This often happens, if you think about water moles, they need something that's pretty wet. So sometimes of the year, or during some years, maybe we have a very wet spring, and it causes the perfect conditions for a blight to form on the leaves of the trees. Okay? And then over here would be blight on fruit and stuff like that may happen at the same time when you have too wet of conditions. So, rain's a good thing, but too much rain can also, cause things like this. Now, we also have the slime molds, which some of you probably have seen these, especially if you have landscaping that uses mulch. And it will kind of like pop up overnight, especially when it's been really wet. Sometimes when you look at it, you think maybe some dog is vomited right there, but it's not dog vomit. It's actually a fungus that's growing there, and it actually has two phases of its life cycle. There's part that you don't see because it's always in the mulch, and then that's the feeding phase where it kind of moves around through the mulch, almost like amoeba, eating decayed material. They're saprophytes. And then overnight they'll kind of pop up, and the fruiting part will come up above ground, and they'll reproduce themselves. The wind can, as they dry, as this will get hard, you'll see kind of a black layer sometimes over the top of it. Those are spores, and they'll just go scattering with the wind to land someplace else in the mulch and do that all over again. But a lot of people will just do is they'll kind of just scoop it up and throw it in the trash. It probably keeps it from spreading if you do that.